Hoş geldiniz diyorum önce herkese. Bugün bayram ve önemli bir gün, 19 Mayıs. Dolayısıyla aslında mühim bir başlangıcın günü olan, sonra da bugünü bize armağan eden Mustafa Kemal Atatürk ve silah arkadaşlarını da sevgi, saygı ve minnetle anıyoruz elbette. Sizleri de bugün burada görmek, bayram gününde aramızda görmek, hep beraber olmak oldukça hoş bizim için. İyi bir kalabalık var. Konuşmacımız da Sayın Albena Yaneva bugün bizimle beraber. Kendisine de hoş geldin ve teşekkür ederiz diyorum. Welcome to Turkey, welcome to AURA, Albena. Elbette bu işin organizasyonu biliyorsunuz Yeditepe Üniversitesi'ndedir. Yeditepe Üniversitesi'nde de böyle yine anlamlı bir günde önemli bir konuşmacıyı AURA'da bizimle buluşturduğu için ayrıca teşekkür ediyoruz. Sayın Yaneva'yı tanıtmak için de derhal bu işin organizasyonunda önemli görev almış olan Burçin hocamıza mikrofonu veriyorum.
Hello all. We are here today for the opening ceremony of the Encounters with the 21st Century, which is the first theme of the first International Architectural Conference of Yeditepe University Department of Architecture called Architectural Studies, Foundations, Positions and Words. On behalf of the whole organizing committee, I welcome you all and welcome Albena again and thank you for accepting our request. Before I give the floor to Professor Dr. Albena Yaneva for her keynote speech, I would like to briefly introduce her to you. Albena Yaneva is Professor of Architectural Theory and Director of Manchester Architecture Research Group at Manchester Urban Institute. She is also the author of several books which have been translated into different languages, such as The Making of Buildings, Mapping Controversies in Architecture, 5 Ways to Make Architecture Political, An Introduction to the Politics of Design Practice, Crafting History, Archiving and Quest for Architectural Legacy, and the New Architecture of Science, Learning from Graphene. Yaneva is also the recipient of RIVA President's Award for Outstanding Researches in 2010. I would now like to invite Professor Dr. Albena Yaneva to the stage to make her presentation. At the end of the presentation, there will be a Q&A session for 15 minutes, and then we will meet again for the cocktail reception. Thank you all again, and have a good day to all of you. Please, Albena. Thank you.
Thank you, Burçin, for this introduction, and thank you for having me here. I'm really delighted and looking forward to the discussion today. I was particularly intrigued by the topic of the conference, Encounters with the 21st Century, which I think it's a great title, and I think that we need more discussions about what has happened to architecture, to our field, to our pedagogy over the past 20 years or so, and to reflect more critically on these encounters. My lecture today is titled Architecture in a Post-Critical Time, to respond to the conference invitation to reflect on 21st century. And I will discuss the post-critical approach, so an alternative of the critical approach that we all shared, I would say, in the second half of the 20th century. So over the course of their work, architects often facilitate the production of social relations and help shape societies. Knowledge in sociology and social sciences is crucial for designers, and that is perhaps the reason why architects have been very much interested in sociologists, and they have been quite interested in sociological perceptions to 21st century problematics as well. I think that is also why sociological work, and in particular the work of Bruno Latour, who is a sociologist I would like to discuss today, has gained popularity among practitioners and and designers in the field of architecture and design studies over the past 20 years, 25 years. A pragmatist perspective, different from the critical one, and these are the two approaches I would like to discuss today. A pragmatist perspective to architecture is possible and relevant to us precisely because of a number of reasons. Yeah, the other way around. Next slide. I have these reasons listed here. First, because there's a growing realization of architecture as a social practice, recognizing the social nature of the outcomes of architectural production. Second, architectural professionals increasingly question understandings and beliefs in relation to knowledge production, innovation, and creativity that are commonly taken for granted. And third, there's a tendency to acknowledge the active role of objects, of materials and technologies in the process of design and in habitation. For instance, scale model, or the role of softwares and what their agency is in architectural thinking. So for all these reasons, there's more and more room to discuss a pragmatist perspective to architecture, and in particular the role of Bruno Latour's sociological thinking and its relevance to the field of architecture. To summarize these contributions, I have recently completed a small book titled Latour for Architects, which is also forthcoming in Turkish with the publisher Katebe Kitap, which I have been discussing with colleagues earlier. So I'm very much looking forward to this book reaching out to you and your students within the next coming months, literally, because this was already translated, where some of these ideas have been presented for an audience of architects and also design studies scholars. In the prevailing kind of approaches in the field, we still discuss pretty much the critical approach as being the dominant approach. The prevailing critical approaches to architecture were developed since the 1960s, and they are based on the method of critique. The main task for these bodies of work, for these theories, is the task of critique. And the task of critique is to reveal what's behind the architectural object, the kind of hidden mechanisms behind the architectural production, and to explain in a way the subjective experience of social agents with their insertion into some kind of social structures. And we very often tend, in the spirit of the critical tradition, we very often tend to explain the final outcome of architectural production, typically a static object, which is represented here with a static face, and we try to reveal the kind of hidden forces, economic, social, political factors or forces that have conditioned the production of a certain type of architecture. We look for explanations in the social and cultural kind of climate. We look at the theoretical influences behind the creator, but also at branding symbols. So in this interpretation, the critical tradition, we very often forget to open the black box of design. So the design object remains very symbolic, very majestic, but also static, a black box, which we're trying to explain with forces, with factors which are outside the field of architecture. Alternatively, the pragmatist approach opens up those black boxes. And we are no longer in the pragmatist tradition, and with the thinking of Bruno Latour, we are no longer interested in architecture made, in the static object of architecture, but we're interested in architecture in the making, in the process, in the production, and the unfolding networks of design creativity. So in the spirit of this approach, and I do believe the 21st century will be very much influenced by this pragmatist approach and this pragmatist way of thinking. In the spirit of this approach, we will be looking more at the process of design and dwelling, the technical choices, the mistake, the workaday choices, the nitty-gritty reality of the design making. We'll be looking to understand the participation of a range of participants in architecture, not just the architect, but a range of other participants and networks, a range of other actors that take part in design and urban practices, and we'll be much more interested in understanding the technologies, the materiality, and the importance of objects and technological agents as parts of the entire network. Or in other words, we'll be much more looking at understanding the inner forces of production of architecture, of interpreting what happens in the field of architecture with features that come from inside. This would mean no longer to contemplate the final object like we did with the iconic building of the Marina Bay project, but this would mean to actually open the doors of an architectural practice. So this is Moshe Safdie, architect, and this is his practice in Boston, and to follow architects and a range of other practitioners in the process of making, designing a building and taking decisions, negotiating different aspects of the building itself, rather than contemplating it as a kind of static object from afar. This would also mean to be very much more interested in what architects and dwellers do, the actions they undertake and assume, rather than the theorists and ideologists in the heads of the creators. This pragmatist approach also invites us to embrace a relational perspective that reinstates previously ignored areas of contemporary urban life. In the spirit of this pragmatist perspective, we cannot rely any longer on society as a source of explanation for architecture. We cannot count on society, politics, and culture to explain us what happens in the field of architecture. Even the social, Latour tells us, does not designate the domain of reality, but is a type of connection, is a type of movement, a type of translation. To understand what the social is, we need to follow the actors. To understand how architecture becomes social, we need to follow architects in the process of designing and negotiating a building with a range of other practitioners, and there comes a better understanding of the architectural production. Or we can summarize these two kind of understandings by looking at the left-hand side of the diagrams, where we have the static object of architecture, and typically explained with an external field outside the kind of remit of architecture. Society is different from architecture and explains us what happens in the domain of architecture, which is the critical approach. And on the right-hand side, we have the pragmatist approach illustrated with architecture in the making. Instead of looking at the static object, we follow the production of architecture, the making of design and cities, and we try to understand the complex networks of practice that unfold when we are in the process of making and dwelling. And this gives us a more realistic interpretation of the architectural production today. So in this lecture, I will argue for the importance to embrace a pragmatist perspective. And I will offer a reflection on some methodological tactics related to this approach. For the purpose of the lecture, I'll draw on three concrete empirical settings: designing, archiving, and dwelling, based on three different fieldworks I have conducted over the past 20 years or so. They all exemplify, in a way, different modalities of architecture in the making and provide examples of ongoing collaborative processes in which people and materials are caught up in a complex web of ecological relations. While they are somewhat biographical and trace my long-term engagement with the field, they aim at providing the background for a methodological reflection, which I'll present at the end of the lecture. And I will elaborate in particular on 6 specific methodological suggestions. So that's the plan. Let us start with the first empirical setting, designing. Designing as a verb, as a process, takes us to the Office for Metropolitan Architecture, where I began my work in the field of architecture, and I found myself there between 2001 and 2004, following different projects of OMA, but working as an anthropologist, interested in the creative processes of and cognitive processes of architectural professionals. So while design has been the subject of multiple studies, architectural scholars have rarely touched on the contingency of design process, or the process of designing as key for understanding how buildings, cities, and environments come into being. To grasp the meaning of OMA buildings and Koolhaas's architecture, we need to forget all about the star architect and what's in his imagination and in his kind of genius. We have to forget all about this and about his buildings even for a moment, and turn away from official interpretations in architectural theory. This means to circumvent understanding of star authorship, because everything that was written by that time was all about his interpretations, his talent, and interpretations in the spirit of star authorship, in the spirit of subjectivist interpretations, or alternatively, critical studies of his architecture in the spirit of critical historicist interpretations of his buildings. And what I did was to rather follow architects in the practice in OMA, architects involved in many different projects at the same time, but also the models, because the model became a very important actor on its own. The foam, the material that was very dominant in the production of OMA buildings, the different software, the different tools mobilized by the architects, but also the entangled networks of engineers, clients, professional model makers, and interior designers as well. This required accounting ethnographically for the ordinary forces and conditions of design experience, following not Rem, the star, but many young designers in the office and the paths that their work have traced. We track the way their actions spread and the way architects make sense of their world-building activities. The routines, the mistakes, the workaday choices usually considered of lesser importance for the understanding of OMA's architecture. In so doing, we can arrive at a better understanding of OMA's design by the means of a detour to design experience. The purpose is to avoid the passage through the vague notion of society, culture, imagination, creativity, these big concepts that we have there and that we bring to explain what happens in architectural production. Thus, from the incidental accounts of design as product, I suggested shifting the attention to design as practice, from buildings as static objects to buildings as uncertain and contested moving targets. This approach requires tracing ethnographically the complex socio-spatial coordinates of design through the daily work of architects, models, instruments, and technologies. The second setting is archiving, and here again we're interested in archiving as a verb. Archive as a verb, archiving. And archiving takes us to the Canadian Centre of Architecture, which I studied between 2015 and 2018. While the fate of established archives in the field of architecture has been the subject of multiple studies, architectural scholars have rarely touched on the mechanisms of constructing these archives and the process of archiving as key for understanding how historical sources in architecture are established. A pragmatist approach to archiving aims at understanding how mundane architectural objects become archival by scrutinizing the specific mechanisms of production of archives in design practice. This is, for instance, Alvaro Siza and his archivist, Chiara, who has worked for the practice for 25 years. So to understand how an archive is being generated in the practice and is closely connected to the dynamics of design, because it's still a very active practice, producing a lot of projects at the moment. A pragmatist approach of archiving would mean to understand how these mundane architecture objects come from the design projects and become archival. We can also trace how architectural archives are assembled to reflect the nature of design in the practice, the nature of design as a heterogeneous and a social process. We examine the situated and local practices of arranging, selecting, preserving, cataloging, and numbering different objects, but also taking care of the objects in the conservation and other practices, preserving, repairing, and maintaining those objects, and how they happen to produce larger structuring effects in a collection. To do this, we need to circumvent, again, traditional understandings of star authorship. We need to forget all about Alvaro Siza and place the attention towards all those people who take care of the production and the maintenance of the archive. We need to forget about the star architect and the curator, who usually remain in the limelight of history with capital H, and to rather follow a myriad of other actors in an archiving institution. Actors like the archivists, the conservators, the digital archivists, librarians, museum technicians, register people, but also instruments, microscopes, solvents, digital files, and codes, and we can continue the list, which is something that will allow us to trace archiving in its mundane and practical course. Following archiving and its web of moves is a way to access the specificity of the current conditions of architecture making. Thus, from the incidental accounts of archives as sources, I suggest shifting the attention to archives as practices, from collections as sites of enduring historical evidence to collections as sites of epistemological reshuffle. A pragmatist approach requires tracing the work of all those participants, human and non-human participants in archiving, and also paying close attention to the various sides of knowledge production and care for the objects. That is what will allow us to understand what architectural archiving is. The third setting is dwelling, inhabiting, and here we'll deal with use as a verb, dwelling as a process. So dwelling takes us to the National Graphene Institute in Manchester, in the city where I work, where I conducted a study between 2017 and 2019 of this particular building. Dwelling is commonly understood here as the process of active settling in, of transforming and appropriating space and adjusting, of living with the varying materiality and programs of a building. So dwelling is a process, and I'm interested in this kind of processual version of dwelling rather than the functionalist concept of use. It is the activity of world-making. Dwelling as a process is the activity of world-making through active participation in the shaping of material form through inhabitation. This is a scientific building, which was built in Manchester in 2015 on the occasion of the Nobel Prize of Physics of two physicists at the University of Manchester, which managed to isolate graphene. Graphene was considered the material of the future, and a new building was needed on campus. So I followed the design process related to this building, and then the process of dwelling in the building. As it is a scientific building, we know that very often, while scientific buildings have been largely explored as a typology, especially in the past 3 decades, there's a lot of attention from design scholars paid to the typology of a science building. Existing research on this typology, however, focused either on the technical side of these lab buildings or on the human interface, studies of communication and studies on the identity of the scientists, for instance. Yet how the technical connects to the human has been rarely explored, how the technical and the human aspects tangle in everyday use of the building, in everyday dwelling in a scientific building, remains largely unexplored. A pragmatist perspective to dwelling circumvents traditional understandings of users and blatant functionalistic post-occupancy accounts that place architects and clients in the limelight. Instead, it follows simultaneously the design infrastructure that makes a science lab possible, so all these kind of sophisticated gas rooms and gray spaces and utility blocks and mechanical workshops and the sophisticated labs, so all this kind of technical performance of the building, and also the human experiences they facilitate. The purpose is to grasp the quality and variability of the experience of different lab dwellers, speeding up as they do, especially in lab work, in the clean rooms where the speed is extreme, and the different laboratories as well, but also slowing down after intensive lab work, slowing down on the terrace, on the top roof terrace of the building, and also in the corridors, which are also designed for the purpose of slowing down. So while tracing dwelling as a process, we also trace the various instrumental practices, the lost track of time, the intensity of communication, the plethora of activities performed in the same compact building, the equipment arrangements, the spatial choreography, and the speed of work. Thus, from the incidental accounts of use and users in a very functionalistic, simplistic way, I suggest shifting the attention to using, inhabiting, and dwelling as processes, as spatial practices, as key for understanding buildings, and especially this generation of 21st century laboratory buildings. A pragmatist approach to dwelling requires tracing the spatial practices and daily work of a range of practitioners and participants that are commonly excluded from the studies of scientific design, such as lab technicians, facility managers, gas room and storeroom technicians, house attendants and porters, but also apparatuses, gas flows, cylinders, and nanoparticles that all take part in scientific production. In all these three settings, we witness how architecture is far from being a projection of society, as illustrated on the left-hand side, but we rather follow the complex network of practices in the three regimes, in the designing, archiving, and dwelling. A pragmatist approach helps us to inquire into the current conditions of life in the world we inhabit and recognizes all its participants. Moreover, it acknowledges all unsung heroes, the younger designers and the foam cutter in an architectural practice, not just the star architect. The conservators, the technicians, the catalogers, and the solvents in an archive, not just the curator or the architect. The lab technicians, the facility managers, the cylinders in the scientific building, not just the lead scientist or the designer. This approach enables us to account all sorts of practical work contributing to the making of architectural knowledge. In all these three cases, designing, archiving, and dwelling are not ways of establishing kinds of stable knowledge, but rather an active, ongoing process of exploring, testing, repairing, and reappraising the architectural connections of design, archival, dwelling objects to the world. Knowledge is mediated, collected, and distributed, and it is constantly reworked. From there, I'll move into the methodological suggestions. How can we study those complex networks of practices where everything is possible, everything is dynamic, everything happens, there's so many participants, human and non-human, who can intrude in the design, dwelling, and archiving process? What is the right approach? The first methodological suggestion is we need to follow these processes slowly. A quick visit of an architectural office, an archive, or a building will provide only an impression of design or dwelling as activities, but hardly an experience of them. It will result in a very quick account. Let's say we quickly visit this building, but we can only produce, once we are on the site, we can only produce a quick account that relies on stable definitions and categories, and we will inevitably become very quick researchers, very hasty writers, and will produce quick accounts by reconnecting the materials from the quick visit, pictures and interviews very quickly collected with the literature and the key concept that exists from a quick browse. However, such a swift and partial perception will inevitably also limit our theory of this building. The interpretation will be analytical and one-sided. As a hasty sightseer, we will begin to replace the missing experience with unrelated notions coming from the world of theory or larger frameworks of society and culture. Yet we can embrace a slow epistemological perspective in a kind of pragmatist way, and as slow researchers we can visit the office, we can visit the sites of designing or dwelling more often, trying to understand the specificity of the designer's experience, observing, documenting, interviewing, and tracing different activities, movements, and gestures, exploring design practice or building through the repeated visits in the design practice or the construction site. We will be able to experience the various speeds and intensities of the processes unfolding there. And this is the key word here, experience. Slowing down, tracing the activities of designers and dwellers, we're able to gain experience of these various speeds and intensity of unfolding processes there. The changing crowds of people, the flows of things circulating there. So follow the moves of the foam as Shiro, a designer from OMA, is using the foam cutter in the office, and as he's trying to reach to that new shape of a building to be. Follow the tentative gestures of the conservator Karen at the Canadian Centre of Architecture. As she's performing, just look at her hands and follow her gestures slowly as she's performing a treatment of a moldy drawing, then placing it in a folder, adding a code on its way of becoming an archival object. Follow the argon, this very specific gas that runs through the system of flows in the scientific building, the National Graphene Institute, reaching out to graphene work in the lab, and follow slowly the gestures of Chris, the technician who is manipulating the gas system, trying to fix the valves. Follow all these gestures very slowly, and you'll gradually gain experience about architectural objects and processes in their own qualities and relations. It is this rich experience that will form the core of our interpretations. This is, I will argue, the only foundation of theory. Second methodological suggestion: chase up all non-humans and trace the relations. It is impossible to understand and account for designing, archiving, or dwelling in concreto without tracing the paths and flows of a variety of non-humans. A pragmatist perspective to architecture gives speed to that which has no language, to the foam, the cutter, the spatula, the mold, the dust, and the gas. All these non-humans are part of the story as they pass action. It is through the sliding of action from subject to model, to foam, to drawing, to potential spaces and other objects that design happens. There is neither simply an architect and a model, an archivist and a moldy drawing, a technician and an infrastructure of flows in a scientific lab. Instead, what enacts the chain of action is the foam cutter that makes the architects bend and interact with the nebulous texture of foam. Or in the archiving setting, it's the fishy smell of a moldy drawing that makes the spatula of the conservator perform a treatment of a drawing. Or in the third case, it's an invisible infrastructure, flows, water and power running through the veins of a scientific lab that are enacted by the technicians and the operations in the classroom. So it's neither the object nor the subject. It's neither the model nor the architect. It's what passes action in between. Follow all these non-humans as they move back and forth between sites, and this will allow us to witness how a design product or an architect or an archive become knowable, traceable, and how they work. Designing, archiving, and dwelling emphasize the active and reciprocal nature of knowing, and in return, they influence how a building or a city is understood. Third suggestion, stay on the ground. Abandon the panoramic views, the panoptic ways of looking at the building or a city. Forget about the Eiffel Tower viewing platform. You believe that Paris can be seen from up there, but it can't. Forget about the office of Rem Koolhaas. You believe that OMA's design can be understood from up there, but it cannot. You thought that the picture you have taken from the galleries of the Canadian Centre of Architecture captured its archival collection, but it doesn't. We rarely witness a building, an archive, or a city as a whole in a kind of glamorous panorama. So abandon all those sites where we talk of these activities as a whole. Focus instead on the small sites, on the small locales of practice, on these misty locales of practice where very little can be seen, but it can be seen well. Those sites, termed by Bruno Latour oligopticums in opposition to panopticums. Oligo, it's little, versus pan, where everything could be seen. Oligopticum is a site where little can be seen, like this room. We can see little, but we can see it well, and we understand much more about the dynamics of architectural research in Turkey, right here, right now, than if we were to get a panoramic view of all universities in the country. So these narrow channels, the oligopticum is termed as these narrow channels through which we can see how human and non-human beings come together to compose a city. And examples of oligopticum include, for instance, the design or the model shop in an architectural studio, the conservation lab in an archive, or the register office in an archive, or the workshop in a scientific building. So we can think about any kind of very specific technical space in an institution, but following the activities in this space slowly can reveal a lot about the institution itself. So once we are in these spaces, in these oligopticums, we find ourselves in offices, in corridors, tracing alignments, instruments, dossiers, codes and solvents, witnessing teamwork, alerts or danger, witnessing negotiations between people. All these rare and fragile places are situated on the ground, not on the top, under our feet, not in our imagination. Moreover, designing or dwelling cannot be captured from a static viewing point. I cannot expect to see Istanbul by sitting on the terrace up there. I have to move around, I have to stroll, I have to change the scales many times. One picture taken from the top is not enough to reveal the specificity of a city or a building. These processes are to be understood only as we move and meander through the different sites of practice, through different oligopticums. A building on an archive can never be seen as a totality, as objective frameworks. This is a pragmatic absurdity. They are to be traced. They are to be composed. They are to be followed. They are to be discovered slowly. Thus, staying on the ground, we can follow trajectories of traces, series of little transformations, series of negotiations between people and things, small and big, perceptible and distinct, running at different speeds, running a different pace of speeds in front of us and with us. Fourth suggestion. Following slowly, staying on the ground, the knowledge practices of designing or archiving emerge as restricted and frangible networks of practice. To better understand them, we should engage in visualizing what we see, in visualizing these complex networks. Tracing architecture ethnographically, we begin to learn a great deal from the visual epistemologies of designers and their techniques of image production. Ethnographic images are usually very dull, very boring. They simply document some practical details. These are some of my very first images from the office for Metropolitan Architecture in Rotterdam. But the visualizations we need should be of a different epistemic style. The visualizations we need should capture the density of the local culture of architects and should contribute also to the arguments we make. Shifting the focus beyond the single-sided ethnographic studies of architectural practices, we should move towards more figurational representations of collaborative networks of design and urban dwelling, rather than simply replacing traditional methods with their computational alternative. A blended method of interviews and observations as well as digital media can be used. This could allow us to witness in the very process of tracing or mapping connections or diagramming and sketching, we can see how an actor emerges or how a very specific concern in an architectural debate emerges and gains more importance than others. So these visuals can inform, enrich, and complete the inquiries we make while we are on the ground. The power of the visual techniques is also important as it lays in their capacity to trace the heterogeneous constitution and dynamics of the networks of practice. To connect to the examples from the three empirical settings I presented, it is clear that 2 years in an architectural practice or in an archive cannot simply be replaced with a figurational map, even if this map is very complex and rich. However, an understanding of such a practice could be much enhanced and complemented by a visualization that adequately situates it within a larger comprehensive network. Such maps could offer visual strength to the analytical arguments made on the basis of ethnography and observation of practices and can allow depicting a degree of complexity that is difficult to capture with traditional qualitative methods, just with interviews or just with observation. Fifth suggestion, redescribe. So drawing on novelists like Calvino, for instance, and the literal theorists like Barthes can also inspire us as architectural theorists to perfect the art of describing processes, describing architectural environments and atmospheres in cities, and also to produce accounts that trace and measure the pluriverse of life without replacing the specific with the general. It is therefore critical to reinvent the narrative techniques of architectural research and architectural theory that will help us. These narrative techniques should be able to help us to gain access to the specific, to the particular, to grasp the unique and to offer adequate descriptions. Equipped with various tools of description, both discursive and visual, our accounts should deploy the networks of designing or dwelling or archiving, instead of simply describing or unveiling in a critical fashion what's behind, what are the forces behind, social, political, or other forces behind. So these narrative techniques will allow us to capture these particular threads that connect different entities, their performances. Sketching across actions in a variety of situations could help us to describe and redescribe these practices from within. A building or an archive do not simply emerge in a series that imply logical sequence or some kind of hierarchy, but their specificity is rather revealed in a network in which one can follow multiple routes. And therefore, the writing techniques should be very similar. The writing should enable us to convey this feeling of following these unfolding networks and following different routes, tracing the plurification of objects, tracing the complexity of buildings, the different times and spaces, and this will be a technique that could help us to situate ourselves within the heart of the urban life and to capture its specificity. And final suggestion, make difference. Committing to describe the variable settings and practices of designing or dwelling means also attending to the specificity, attending empirically to the disorderly specificities of the world of architecture. In each empirical situation that we study, we are confronted with what Donna Haraway calls situated knowledge, very specific situated knowledge. Just as design knowledge is specific and arises out of the practices of architects or dwellers as they sketch or inhabit a building, ethnographic knowledge is also very specific and irredeemably messy. Empowered by a pragmatist approach, we can witness states of unstable, kind of idiosyncratic relationships. We also experience symbolic architectural settings. We describe their specificity, contingency, and heterogeneity. However, describing these practices is also about making difference. It is a form of interference. While engaging in close redescription of those practices and unfolding networks, we do not take sides. We don't have to take sides and identify the bad and the good guys. We are all, as Donna Haraway tells us also, we're all located in the belly of the monster. When we are within those practices, we are in this complex belly of a monster. We describe, we convey the specificity, we attend to the specificity and the contingency of architecture. And the more we describe, the more we immerse into these worlds of design, the more we understand them and the more we learn. Our knowledge practices become performative, and so are our theoretical accounts as researchers. The more specific they get, our descriptions, our theoretical descriptions, the more specific they get, the more our ability to intrude in design worlds will increase. Sometimes the descriptions start interfering. They start interfering in our objects of study. According to the angle we take, according to the actors we decide to follow, all these very specific angles we take make us produce description that intrude into the world, that are performative, and these descriptions make difference. And that is how we intervene, and we interfere. And that is our way to trigger change. In conclusions, a pragmatist perspective helps us to move successfully beyond the existing trends of subjectivist approaches, always referring to the creator in what's in the imagination, in the childhood of Rem Koolhaas, the imagination, the creative energy of this one creator. Or alternatively, the critical historical approaches that refer to the historical conditions and the context of architecture making that had an impact on the design works. So we could overcome these two extreme and prevailing in the 20th century interpretations and approaches to architecture by endorsing a pragmatist one. A pragmatist approach will allow us to conduct inquiries into the current conditions and future possibilities of architecture. In this type of inquiry, the questions that we'll be asking are different. It's not a question of asking about the nature of things, about the essence of architecture. These are not questions that will start with, what is this? What is this? As Deleuze has pointed out many times, this is a question that, the questions that begin with what is, are questions that assume the simplicity of essence. The questions to be asked today are rather different. Questions like, what does a building do? What does an archive, how does an archive work? Or how does a city work? Who and what sets the city in action? What are the modalities of action of this building or this archive? How does it become traceable, knowable? And under what circumstances can it be seen, grasped, understood, and composed? So these are how questions rather than what questions. And these are the questions that the theorists in 21st century should be asking. This is just the summary of the suggestions, methodological suggestions, and here I will complete. Attending to the specificity of designing and city making, accounting the local architectural orderings of the reality, can also instigate a different thinking about design among practitioners. Thank you.
Thank you, Albena, for your presentation. We can start Q&A session now. Sometimes I think that actually it's not a question, it's just, I just want your opinion, because sometimes I just think that the conventional knowledge of architectural education, or the way of thinking, architectural way of thinking, that we also learned from architectural schools, maybe cause of these kind of analysis problems and so on, because even if if you are reading a kind of critical article about a building or so, we are always talking about the final product and the outcome of it. And if someone tries to talk about the behind the scene process or the all kind of networks, it's generally being accepted as a kind of rumors of architecture and so on, but I believe that that kind of rumors also constitute a kind of knowledge in there. And the analysis, if we do not start the analysis in there, we cannot talk about architecture. But for many people, even for many academics, people believe that if you're not talking about the building itself, it's not the architectural way of critics. But actually, all the process, I'm not talking about the design process only, all the elements, all the actors of the process, I mean for example, the facilities of the architectural firm has, all the background of the architectural firm, or their maybe the political thought, or their money that they have for the project and so on. That also constitutes that building. But generally, we tend to analyze or critique everything according to its design or construction methodologies or something like that, and we are missing some point. Maybe we need to redefine the borders of analysis or the criticisms in here, because no one talks behind the scene process. Everyone wants to talk about the object in itself, but the object is just a final product, and it's the very little part of the process, and it's not the knowledge in itself, actually. I really wonder what you think about those kind of things, about the rumor things.
That's a very important aspect. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, well, I have encountered this kind of resistance at the very start of my study at the OMA. Actually, after 2 days, because my plan was to stay in the OMA for 2 years as an ethnographer. Yeah, for 2 years. And on the second day, and I said to Marcus, thank you very much, but I'm still staying in the office. And then they were quite also puzzled, because they were also not used to that kind of presence. They were used into a journalist coming and just doing an interview with the big star, right? Or staying in the office for a couple of days to see a little bit more, but again, do a couple of interviews with the big star and nothing more. Someone interested in the younger designers, they have never had this attention. Or someone interested in how designers and value engineers communicate, how they negotiate a building, or how then structural engineers, value engineers, and designers from OMA, but again, not the star architect, not Rem. Rem is there once a month. Yeah, basically coming into the office, everyone is terrified. And then he goes on 10 different projects, of important buildings. I was at the moment when the CCTV Tower of Beijing was kind of in the making. They have just completed the Seattle Public Library. Some of the models were still there. The Casa de Musica in Porto, some of this kind of moment of OMA with kind of signature buildings. And he will come and he will just play on these 10 different chess tables, will make a move on these chess tables, and then he'll disappear. But then in the rest of the time, the reality of design making is about young designers, your age, working there on a daily basis, constantly collaborating with different other people coming in and going out of the office. And this diagram was not helpful for me because this is an oversimplification of the design process. And I was also very lucky that I had access to all these projects. I had access to the archive. I could follow also the documentation of the different projects. And it was an unusual approach indeed, and it was, I would say at the beginning, it was met with a lot of resistance, including by Rem Koolhaas, who, because the first project I followed was the Whitney Museum of American Art, which failed after 2 years. And then Ren realized, you're recording this, you cut this part. Ren realized that because the project is failing, the book I'm writing is going to be about a failed project. So it's not a glorious building in glorious New York any longer. And then he became extremely suspicious. He wanted to see everything I write. There was some difficult moments when he also wanted to control what kind of information or rumor will go out of the office and what kind of stories will be told about the process of design, because I was there for this entire duration of some of the project, like the entire duration of the project. In other cases, like what was rumor, like for instance, the Casa de Musica in Porto, there were rumors that these were models from a previous project, like a private house in the suburbs of Rotterdam. The client didn't like the project. The model was just hanging around in the office, and then they have taken it, recycled it, like literally recycled the project, of course, after careful integration in the new context, and this became the Porto Casa de Musica. Okay, we can tell this story as a rumor, but if we are there and we follow how this actually happens, then it becomes a real story about what design is about. Design is very much about recycling and reusing ideas we have had 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I have seen this also in Alvaro Cesa's office. He will come in the archive and he will tell the archivist, Cara, and he'll make a drawing. I have done this door handle, design of a door handle in 1978. Yeah, but I don't remember which project was it. He remembered the year, so it's interesting how the memory functions. And then Kara will take the drawing and we'll go in the archive and we'll find the exact project where the door handle belongs to. Then the archive will come, and then the archive will go back to the office of Caesar, and the archive will be the extended technical memory of Caesar's memory, because this is also the memory of the practice. And you can see how this kind of details, and this will be circulated as a rumor further on, but then you see how this kind of important dialogue with the archive is part of the process of designing, and how impossible it is to disentangle archiving from designing, because the two activities are very organically related. So in other words, if we stay longer to understand what exactly happened in the practice, and if the doors are open for us to follow closely these processes, we could tell a fascinating story of how these design networks unfold, which would be a different story than the simple rumors that we hear or we read about in architectural journals, let's say, or yeah.
Because sometimes those kind of rumors can change all our perspectives to that building or the architects itself, actually. Thank you.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, I am more curious about your role as a social scientist researcher when you access the architectural firms. How do you negotiate, like, what you want to do there? How does it work in the process that you have the access? What is the limits of your access? And then how do you negotiate, like, what you're going to disseminate? Like, what are your limits? What are those boundaries? I'm also curious about the dynamics of those offices. Like, are you, as a social scientist there, are you, like, very, I guess, new to the firm? Or do they have people in those roles that contribute to that kind of knowledge in the office before you go there?
Yeah, that's a very good question of methodology indeed. Yeah, with the very first practice with OMA, I was given total access to everything, because the architect himself was quite interested in this approach as well. Rem Koolhaas was quite interested in a kind of social studies, anthropological perspective to his work, as I was a student of Bruno Latour before coming to the field of architecture, and I worked mainly on contemporary art with Hans-Ulrich Obrist in Paris, who was also part of Koolhaas's network. So networks are quite important in this context, because otherwise I would have never had access to the practice if I was coming from another sociological tradition, let's say Bourdieu, or another tradition, or another sociological school. So not every architect will open the door easily, without preliminary contacts, and I had many difficulties afterwards with other practitioners who were skeptical, or who would agree, just the star architect would agree to give me an interview, but they would deliberately lock the door, so I cannot have access to the actual practice, which is what is interesting for me, to actually see how design happens. And they were very suspicious into me having access to the behind-the-scenes process, because they were not used to that kind of attention. I'm talking about small-scale, like middle-scale practices. And my recent experience with small-scale practices is the opposite. They were quite forthcoming. They were quite open. I did a small book on the architects during the pandemic, and I interviewed 130 practices, but this was on Zoom, obviously. I couldn't have access, especially during the pandemic, to 130 different practices, and the response I got from small-scale practices was amazing. Yeah, also the innovative kind of aspect of their responses, the resourcefulness of architects during the pandemic, especially small-scale practices of up to 10 people working in a practice. But that's a good question of how you negotiate boundaries after you have been given this access. Of course, it's a complex relationship. Yeah, if they get disappointed or suspicious that I'll tell a story that they're not happy with, obviously some doors will become getting closed, and they will make me sign an agreement, like a confidentiality agreement for some projects that are kind of sensitive, either political sensitive or budget kind of sensitive, and then of course they don't want this information to be disseminated further. I had projects like this as well, a project in the UK with Foreign Office architects, which was extremely controversial. It was in the media, very politically sensitive, and obviously I couldn't publish this. So sometimes you spend a lot of time, you have rich material, and you think, yeah, this is an amazing material, but if you don't have the consent of the research participants, obviously you cannot publish. There's some limitations as well. And we depend on them. We depend on the people we follow. And we have to respect this, I think, yeah, if they're not happy or if this will create inconveniences for the practice or some kind of discomfort. So then we have to respect this as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello. First of all, thank you for the presentation. I have a two-part question. The first one is, as industrialization and modernism sort of created a distance in the craftsmanship, and change the speed of life and sort of focus more on the production, which took the focus from the actor to the produce. We see that the worth belongs then to the produce, but not the actors, which are mostly forgotten, as you mentioned. So I was thinking, how would it be possible to emphasize the actors better? Should big companies also slow down to change this trend and start to share more of their processes? And my second question is, how can we be better writers in witnessing these processes? Do you have any suggestions on that? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, these are amazing questions. Well, they require long answers, but I'll start with the writing part, yeah, which I think it's important for us in the architectural field. I would say becoming better writers, being inspired by novelists, artists, experimental or creative writing pieces will be quite important for us. That's why I mentioned Calvino, but there are many other examples as well. And Calvino has been quite popular among architects, right? He has been in architectural schools for a while, but we can also look at even writers. I was thinking yesterday when I arrived in Istanbul about Orhan Pamuk and the kind of Istanbul and the flavors and the colors of Istanbul that we get from his novels. Like even novelists that we have in our national heritage or in the kind of national heritage of literature could inspire a different style, different thinking of cities, thinking about the detail in particular, right? Thinking about contextual specificity of practices or urban life. I would say any novelist could inspire more than any social scientist. I'm very critical to social scientists here, yeah, because we have a very also in social science a very rigid style of precisely repeating this diagram of societies here, and society is made out of groups and classes and genders, this kind of very static distribution of forces, and then architecture is here, and then we try to explain architecture and what architectural field is made of by bringing some of these categories of the structure of the society, and we don't question. So we explain, but we don't question. And what we should do is to question and to slow down and interpret and understand what is it that we actually have in the field of architecture. What is it that this building is made of? What is the specificity of a practice? So slowing down, fully unpacking and understanding the specificity, interpreting it, and using a language that a novelist will use to convey this specificity, the flavor, the particular, the kind of the magic of a space, the atmosphere of a space, would help us much more than reproducing the rigid language of mainstream social scientists, I would say, with all the categories that we hear: inequality, sustainability. What is it? We have to question, we have to understand what does it mean and how exactly it comes to us as a phenomenon today. To your first question, which is very complex as well, yeah, practices will remain very skeptical, I think, into kind of into questioning and into any kind of inquiries that will question this relationship between processes, technologies, and the final product. And I don't have a solution here of how we can make them more understanding. Perhaps because we all know, let's say for some particular type of architecture like Gehry, for Gehry's building, we all know that Gehry's approach is not possible without the software, without CATIA as a software. We all know OMA's architecture is not possible without foam. Yeah, I had a very funny experience in the practice, like literally on the second month in the practice, Reim came to me and he said, now we're going to do a sociological experiment. 1 month without models, yeah, and I will tell them to, yeah, we'll absolutely, models will be banned and you can record, and this could become a wonderful article. He was thinking very carefully of what he wanted me to write about the practice. Okay, let's see if we can do it. It was impossible to do it because this technology was so much ingrained into the creative habits of the architects that they cannot think about the shape, they cannot think about the building without the foam. Then they ended up, after a couple of weeks of discussions, they ended up replacing the blue foam with white foam. And that was the end of the experiment. So some technologies are so much ingrained into the approach of the practice that you cannot even imagine talking about the final product without connecting it to the process and the specific technological steps. I cannot look at an OMA building without thinking, oh, well, what kind of foam shape was there before? Which is maybe a perverse way of kind of looking at the buildings, but I'm sure a lot of architects have this approach, like also the pandemic type of architecture, which was predominantly produced on flat screens. I'm sure now we will be walking in cities and we'll be wondering, this flatness, was this produced during this flat building, was this produced during the pandemic when no 3D visualizations or communications was possible? So these connections are in our mind and we need to make them visible in our theories in one or another way, whatever the resistance we meet from the research subjects that we'll have in the future.
My question is about the methodology of the research. You talked about the fieldwork, but the pre-fieldwork, while the creation of the hypothesis and the theory, is it important for the researcher to distance themselves while creating the topics of observation and the relations with the agents? So you probably start with some questions and some topics, the main topics, the fields of observation. For example, the tools of creation, tools of production in your study. So I'm curious about the process of deciding the pre-field work of how you analyze the relations between the agents, because this methodology can also be implemented on, for example, more political aspects of architectural production. Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, can you hear me like this? Yeah, if I put the mic in. Yeah, that's a very important question, but I would say we have to be flexible as well. Yeah, because I know everyone will do like a very specific research project, and we are told we have to be very specific and solid in our research design, in having the right research question, the right aim and objectives, and to fix everything or have a hypothesis before we go. But as soon as we are on the field and we engage with these complex activities that I just described, we have to be open to surprises. And sticking to our initial question would be silly if there's an alternative, fascinating alternative, other question that just presents, kind of emerges into the process of inquiry, or another project that is there that we haven't kind of anticipated learning about. I had this experience both in Alvaro Caesar's case and also in OMA's case. In OMA, OMA's case, my plan was just to kind of more conduct an inquiry from the point of view of cognitive anthropologists, how designers think, how an idea emerges in a practice that is so complex as OMA, because obviously we're not talking about one imagination or one idea sparking the imagination of one architect, but it's a much more complex social and cognitive choreography. And that's what I wanted to understand. But as soon as I entered the office, the very first day, the very first visit in the office, on the table of models, because every project is on a separate table, I have seen the Whitney Museum for American Art, this fascinating project which I discovered had an interesting story, a series of failures in the past, in the 60s, in the 80s, and then I got completely obsessed by this project. And by deciding to follow this project, the project leads you to a different set of questions, and you have to be open to this kind of flexibility. Yeah, don't be stuck with the initial questions you have, but if there's a new empirical case, a new empirical story that kind of presents to you, then follow this story, and then the project will suggest different questions that might be kind of perhaps somewhat related to the first questions you had when you made your first hypothesis. The same with Alvaro Caesar's case, because he was surprised that I wanted to talk to the archivist. Of course, I had an interview with him, but I was much more interested in spending more time in the archive. And Chiara became a bigger hero than Alvaro Caesar, and he was not used to this. Yeah, he was very generous and gentleman, and brilliantly responded to my questions in an amazing way. And he's in his mid-80s, but then he understood that my attention was more to Chiara, and she was in the ground floor. No one was ever interested in her, and she told me, "No, everyone comes to this office but never talks to me. I'm just this invisible person taking care of the archive." And she has done this for 20-25 years. She has been this kind of invisible person, thanks to whom, and the practice of the entire archive, which is a floor like this, the practice continues to work and has this kind of complex extended technical memory, which I talked about. And you have to also gently prepare the actors that you'll be interviewing, that it's not just about them, but it's about all these kind of other invisible heroes, these other participants, these other kind of participants in the network. And if they can understand that the attention sometimes drifts, that the questions also change. With the more you follow, the more different kind of paths you follow, and the more different actors you discover, the more your research questions will change, but they can also become richer. So don't be afraid of this.
Is there any other question? Okay, no, thank you, Albena. I think